The boarding agent didn't just deny him. He tore the ticket in half. Jamal Roads stood still, watching the small, jagged pieces of his first-class pass flutter to the polished airport floor like discarded trash. "This line is for premium travelers," the man snapped. "You people don't belong here." Around them, the morning rush at Eastway International moved like any other day, parents juggling strollers, executives sipping overpriced coffee, announcements echoing overhead. But in that pocket of terminal light, time paused. The insult didn't come with shouting. It came with assumption about skin status, presence. Behind the counter, the agent's hand hovered near the intercom. "Security will sort this out," he muttered. And within minutes, officers flanked Jamal, treating him not like a client, but a suspect. What no one realized, not the smug gate agent, not the guards now rifling through his belongings, not even the fellow passengers recording the scene with curiosity and disbelief, was that Jamal Roads wasn't just another black man in a hoodie. He was the majority stakeholder of the very airport they were standing in. And in exactly 10 minutes, he'd own it entirely. If you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that expose the truth. Jamal didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply stood there watching two security officers, Officer Lyle and Officer Brent, circle him like they'd done this before, like this was a routine they knew by heart. Their expressions carried the easy arrogance of assumed authority. One reached for his duffel bag, the other for his wrist. "Hands where we can see them," we all ordered, voice just loud enough for the line of travelers behind them to hear. Jamal complied, lifting his arms slowly, his fingers relaxed and open, not out of fear, but because he knew what they were looking for. A reaction. They wouldn't get it. The buzz of rolling luggage continued around them, but whispers began weaving through the air. A woman clutched her purse closer. A teenager paused mid-step, then doubled back to watch. The buzz of the airport had changed frequency. It was no longer the sound of transit, it was tension. Officer Brent rummaged through Jamal's belongings without asking. Charger's laptop, leather-bound folder pulled out, set aside, inspected like contraband. "You travel often?" Brent asked, barely looking up. Jamal responded without hesitation. "Every week." Brent scoffed. "With this setup, seems like a stretch." Jamal said nothing. Inside that silence lived every moment like this that had come before, every delayed boarding, every random search, every employee who double-checked his ID with a side glance, every "sir" that didn't mean respect, but suspicion. He had cataloged them all, filed them away, not for revenge, for truth. Behind the check-in counter, the boarding agent, Alan Lawson, stood with arms crossed, watching with a satisfaction he didn't bother hiding. His body language said it all. This was exactly how he wanted it to go. "I told you," he muttered to Officer Lyle, gesturing to the shredded ticket. "People pull stunts like this all the time. Flashy phones, acting like they belong in first class." Jamal heard him, so did half the terminal, but he didn't flinch. He didn't have to. Because what Alan didn't know was that the flashy phone he had dismissed held more than just a boarding pass. It held a direct channel to legal infrastructure, public relations, and digital control for the entire Roads Dynamics portfolio. That phone had been quietly pinged the moment Jamal's credentials were flagged, triggering a silent alert. Back at headquarters, Noel, his longtime executive assistant, watched the red alert flash across the upper right corner of his screen. He stood from his desk and whispered a single word: "Activate." Within seconds, the legal team, the data team, and infrastructure control were in motion. But at Eastway International, Jamal sat alone in a side corridor of the terminal under fluorescent lights that hummed like static. His wrists weren't cuffed, but his dignity had already been restrained. Brent sat across from him, still scrolling through Jamal's device without cause. "You're awful calm for someone caught impersonating a passenger," Brent said with a smirk. "Impersonating," Jamal repeated quietly. "Name doesn't match the attitude," Brent replied. Jamal stared at him. "It's on the reservation. You didn't even ask for ID." Brent leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head. "We know the type. You show up with a barcode and an attitude, thinking a designer hoodie gets you on a first-class flight." Jamal's gaze never left him. He didn't blink. He didn't argue. He just memorized every word. The way Brent's eyes narrowed when he said designer hoodie, the way his tone dipped when he said your type, the way assumptions dressed themselves up as policy. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was how easily it slipped out like a reflex. Meanwhile, Alan returned to the holding room, tablet in hand, looking smug. I checked the manifest. No record of a Jamal Roads in first class. Checked it twice. Check it again, Jamal said calmly. With investor access. Alan froze. The room grew quiet. What did you say, he asked? I said. Jamal repeated, still composed, check the investor list. Then check your badge history. Then check the server logs. Alan laughed nervously. Nice bluff. But he was already sweating. Outside in the terminal, something had shifted. Travelers began murmuring. A younger employee, Eli, stood near the corner of the check-in area, watching the commotion with a strange sense of recognition. He tilted his head, brows furrowed. Then he whispered to the supervisor next to him, I think that's Jamal Roads, the guy from the cover of Tech Executives Monthly. You sure? The supervisor whispered back. Positive. The ripple had started. Jamal sat quietly, one knee crossed over the other. He could have ended it right there with one call, but he waited, not for vindication, but for the system to reveal itself. Every second, the airport continued to escalate. It was writing its own indictment. And Jamal, he was watching the pen write every word. At 9:17 a.m., Jamal sat in the gray windowless holding room tucked behind the Eastway International security corridor. The air smelled of old laminate and stale coffee. On the table in front of him was nothing, no folder, no water, not even a form. Just space. He wasn't handcuffed, but he might as well have been. The silence had a weight to it, designed to press against dignity like a test. Alan stood leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, breathing like he had just climbed 5 flights of stairs. Still not talking, huh? He said. Jamal didn't look up. He didn't need to. From his inner jacket pocket, Jamal slowly pulled out a slim metal card, brushed steel engraved in black, Roads Dynamics Global Infrastructure Division. It had no contact number, no job title, just a single scannable chip embedded near the edge. Alan snorted. What's that supposed to be? A business card. Jamal placed it on the table like a judge might place a gavel. Alan didn't touch it. Behind the one-way mirror, the airport's deputy director of operations, Lorna Jeffries, stood with arms stiff at her sides watching the feed. The more she looked, the more unease began settling in her gut. Pull up everything on that name, she said to the assistant behind her. Jamal Roads, and fast. Yes, ma'am, the assistant replied, already typing. Down in the terminal, Ali, the young employee in the blue vest, stood awkwardly near gate 3. He kept checking his phone. That face, that name. He knew he was right. He had seen Jamal on a panel during a youth entrepreneur summit streamed live last month. Eli had even taken notes. Respect is the baseline, not the reward, Jamal had said. And I build systems that don't forget that. Why do you look like you've seen a ghost? Asked his coworker Felicia. I think. He hesitated, then showed her Jamal's LinkedIn profile on his phone. Felicia's eyes widened. No way. In the back office, the assistant gasped. Ma'am, I have something. Lorna stepped forward. On the screen was a press release dated the 9 months prior. Roads Dynamics expands strategic infrastructure partnership with Eastway International Airport, estimated value $420 million. The attached PDF was clearer, majority stakeholder RDI Holdings, subsidiary of Roads Dynamics. Equity voting rights active. Operational clauses. On file. Lorna blinked. Wait, are you telling me? Yes, ma'am, he's not just a passenger, he's one of the owners. Lorna's breath caught. In the next room, Jamal leaned back, checked his watch, and exhaled slowly. 10 minutes had passed, and upstairs the system had already started to wobble. At Roads Dynamics headquarters, 2 time zones away, a room of analysts sat before large curved monitors watching red indicators flash to green. A security breach log had been recorded, cross-verified against investor credentials, and flagged with a high-priority tag, violation of executive class equity holder. Noel Jamal's chief of executive operations didn't need a full report. He saw the alert, pulled up the airport's back-end database, and logged in through a secure node. Within 60 seconds, Noel had already activated Clause 7B of their investor contract. Quietly, without fanfare. Clause 7B stated, if Roads Dynamics representative is subject to escalated confrontation, denial of services, or any treatment deemed reputationally or operationally injurious by Eastway International Airport staff, Roads Dynamics may assume temporary control of infrastructure systems for internal audit purposes. It had never been triggered before. Until now. Inside the holding room, Officer Brent finally looked uncomfortable. His radio crackled. Control to Brent. Do you have the name again? Jamal Roads, Brent replied, clearing his throat. Repeat. Say again, Roads. Jamal, R-H-O-A. No. The voice on the radio cut in sharply. Spelling doesn't matter. Release him. Now. Director's orders. Brent glanced over at Alan, who mouthed, ignore it. Jamal stood up slowly. You might want to check that radio again, he said. The door behind Alan flew open. Director Martin Hensley stormed in, a tablet in hand and sweat on his collar. What in God's name have you done? He hissed, pointing a shaking finger at Alan. Sir, he tried to use a fake pass. He owns the airport, Hensley snapped. Or at least a quarter of it. That fake pass is registered to a VIP investor class. I've got legal and 3 news outlets already pinging me, asking about detaining a man with controlling interest in our fiber security systems. Alan stepped back. I didn't know. Jamal remained standing, hands in his pockets, unmoved. Exactly. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was surgical. At that moment, null system authorization completed. In New York, London, and Zurich, silent pings spread across high-security dashboards. The phrase appeared in identical blue type on every screen, roadmap initiated, transition underway. Back in Eastway's control center, systems flickered, passwords were changed, access logs archived. The ownership baton wasn't passed, it was claimed. And Jamal, he didn't lift a finger. The moment was never about rage. It was about revelation. That beneath the hoodie behind the casual look was a man who didn't need to yell to command. He was the system. The sun crept higher outside the glass walls of Eastway International Airport, casting long slashes of light across the terminal floor. Travelers bustled about, oblivious to the fact that the entire digital infrastructure of the airport had just shifted ownership quietly, surgically, like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. At check-in counters and departure gates, systems responded a beat slower than usual. Security terminals flickered once before resetting. In the background, a machine was beginning to groan under the weight of its own decay. Inside the administration wing, Director Martin Hensley paced like a man whose secrets were leaking through the walls. Legal had called twice. Public relations left 3 voicemails marked urgent, and 8 had issued a soft warning. Multiple user credentials had been overridden with something tagged Priority Level RDI Executive Access. He stormed into the operations conference room, where a half-dozen supervisors sat frozen before a projection screen. The feed displayed real-time logs, login attempts, and network pings bouncing off private cloud servers. Why weren't we alerted that Rhodes Dynamics had this kind of access, he barked. Marla Singh, head of internal infrastructure, flinched. We were told the clause was symbolic. Just optics, something the investor relations team agreed to during the fiber optics expansion. Well, it's not symbolic anymore, Hensley snapped. They just used it to seize our infrastructure. In the back of the room, Marcus Liddell, a veteran air traffic systems analyst, spoke softly. Sir, we've had red flags for a while now. The profiling complaints, the escalation logs. We were warned. Hensley turned, warned by who? Marcus didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his folder and slid out a single-page internal report, security conduct deviations, Alan Lawson, 3X. 3 incidents, each marked reviewed, no action taken. The oldest was from 2018. The most recent 3 weeks ago. Who buried this? Hensley muttered. Silence. Back in the terminal, Jamal walked calmly through the concourse, having been released from the holding room with a mumbled apology and a hastily opened gateside escort. Passengers began to recognize him, some only from the growing Twitter thread posted by Eli. Others from tech blogs, business articles, or the viral clip now spreading like wildfire online, security detains Black CEO with ownership stake in airport. The caption beneath the clip read, They tore his boarding pass. He owns the terminal. Jamal ignored the stares. He didn't need to explain himself. His walk alone was indictment enough. A few feet behind him, Null walked with brisk purpose, quietly briefing Jamal on the state of the network handover. We've rerouted all emergency infrastructure pings to Rhodes Dynamics servers. Passenger data remains untouched, but the audit logs are now under private review. Alan's terminal credentials are void. Brent and Lyall's access to dispatch has been frozen. We've also triggered compliance audit B. Jamal gave a quiet nod. Send everything to federal oversight. Null hesitated. You're sure? Jamal stopped. Turned. I didn't spend 20 years building a system just to play nice with the rot inside it, he said. I'm not here to embarrass them. I'm here to clean house. At that moment inside the HR suite on level 3, a small team of compliance officers sat around a glowing red alert that pulsed from the center of their dashboard. They were the ones responsible for internal incident management, the same ones who had signed off on Alan's old infractions. The same ones who once dismissed complaints as misunderstandings. The screen now read immediate review, required conflict of interest detected in prior complaint, resolution process. Who approved this? Asked Deborah Klein, the lead auditor. The silence that followed was broken only by the slow shuffle of a single name rising again and again on the screen. Alan Lawson, status pending investigation. In the corner of the airport cafe, Eli sat stunned as his phone buzzed endlessly. His post had exploded online. Dozens of users tagged major news outlets. One comment stood out. If this is true, Eastway's facing a lawsuit so big, it might need its own runway. Meanwhile, in a sleek conference room in Zurich, two Roads Dynamics board members, Simone Vasquez and Anwar Malik, reviewed the emergency clause Jamal had activated. Anwar exhaled through his nose. He didn't wait for approval. Simone sipped her espresso because approval wasn't required. Anwar leaned back, watching the live update feed. Do we support this? Simone didn't answer. Instead, she tapped the screen. The headline flashed across it. Black CEO detained while holding ownership rights to airport. Investor rights activated. She looked up. The world is watching. We support the truth. In Eastway's security office, Alan Lawson sat staring at his blank login screen. His clearance had been revoked. His inbox had disappeared. On the wall behind him, a motivational poster that once read, "Security is trust," now felt ironic. He turned to Brent, who stood silent, arms crossed. They're tearing it all down, Alan said. No, Brent replied, voice low. We did. Across the terminal, Jamal finally reached the escalator that led to the private departures gate. He didn't turn back, didn't slow down. But before disappearing from view, he looked over his shoulder just once, and that look said everything. The system was being reset, and it would not remember the names of those who had let the rot fester. Not this time. Eli Ramirez had never planned to be the center of anything. At 23, fresh out of a hospitality program at Eastside Community College, his goal was simple: help passengers clock out, go home. His blue vest wasn't stitched with power. It was stitched with invisibility, a uniform people ignored unless they needed a gate change or to complain about a missing charger port. But today, the moment he recognized Jamal Roads and chose to say something had cracked something open inside him. At first, Eli thought it might blow over, a small hiccup, maybe a tense conversation and an apology behind closed doors. But now, sitting in the staff lounge with a cup of cold coffee untouched in his hands, he watched the ripple he started become a wave. On his phone screen, the video he posted just 20 seconds long was now at over 2 million views. Comments poured in by the second. The quiet kid in the vest changed the game. You're the reason we know the truth. Sometimes the smallest voices wake the world up. Eli didn't feel like a hero. His hands were still shaking. Across the lounge, his supervisor, Darlene Mayfield, paced with her arms folded. She had known Jamal's name sort of, enough to recall some vague article about Roads Dynamics and urban tech. But it wasn't until the live footage began circulating that the scale hit her. She turned to Eli. You sure it was him? Eli nodded. He looked right at me. It was him. Darlene hesitated, then handed Eli a clipboard. This is a request from HR. They want a written account of everything you saw this morning. Eli blinked. Am I in trouble? No, she said, but her voice faltered. They just need records. He nodded slowly, then took the clipboard and began writing. The first sentence came out clear. I saw Mr. Jamal Roads present his boarding pass, and I saw Alan tear it up. Deja. In the airport security office, Brent sat silently beside Officer Lyall. Neither said a word, but both could feel the room darkening. Their dispatch feed was limited now, certain terminals' inaccessible clearance levels mismatched. Lyall glanced at the muted television mounted on the wall where a local news anchor repeated the headline, Black CEO detained at airport he partially owns silent takeover unfolding. Brent grunted. You think he's really taking the whole thing? Lyall shook his head. Not think, no. I've seen that clause in the investment terms. The one nobody paid attention to because they never thought it'd be used. Reckon we're next, Brent asked. We should be, Lyle muttered. We let this happen. In Terminal C, a woman named Denise Chen stood near Gate 12, her tablet trembling slightly as she flipped through her open HR compliance dashboard. As Eastway's new hire onboarding lead, she had been the first to receive the real-time system update, compliance audit triggered by priority level stakeholder, immediate review of past escalated incidents. Her breath caught as the flag names rolled in: Alan Brent, Tara Kenneth, all the usual suspects. People she'd filed minor concerns about, but had been told to document quietly and avoid stirring things up. One flagged entry from last summer stood out: an older woman named Gladys Johnson, wrongfully pulled from the priority line. Denise had filed that report herself. It had been dismissed. Now it was back marked under review, tagged by the new system. Denise didn't know Jamal Roads personally, but she knew what it felt like to be told to be quiet. Let it go, it's not worth the trouble. Her fingers hovered above the internal communications app. She began typing to all onboarding staff. If you've witnessed past discriminatory actions, this is your moment. Submit your reports again. Everything will be seen now. She hit send. In a staff corridor, Lydia Grant walked slowly past the row of lockers where airport staff hung their vests and uniforms at shift's end. She'd worked here for over 20 years, long enough to see patterns repeat. Long enough to know that diversity training often meant a PDF and a forgotten login. But this was different. She had seen Jamal's eyes when Tara printed that denied slip, calm, sharp, unflinching. It had reminded her of something her father once said after being turned away from a lunch counter in 1964. You don't have to shout to break a wall. Sometimes you just lean, and if the wall's hollow, it cracks. She pulled out her phone, opened her voice memo app, and began to record. My name is Lydia Grant. I've worked at Eastway International for 21 years. I witnessed the discriminatory treatment of a man who was not only a valid passenger but a stakeholder in our institution. This is my testimony. She didn't rehearse it. She didn't edit it. She uploaded it straight to the employee whistleblower portal, and then she waited, not for someone to respond, but for the wall to crack. Back in Zurich, Jamal sat in silence, watching the internal dashboards light up like constellations. Every new submission, every employee whistleblower, every pattern confirmed was another light in the dark. Beside him, Noel scrolled through the live data feeds, speechless. Jamal spoke without turning. They're waking up. That's all we needed. The silence of the Zurich suite was broken only by the faint rhythm of keys tapping. Jamal sat with one leg crossed over the other, his posture as calm as ever, but his eyes sharp, unblinking. In front of him, the dual monitors glowed with data streams, real-time access to Eastway's back-end servers, complaint logs, surveillance footage, and employee access records. Noel sat to his right, face lit by the bluish tint of his screen, fingers moving in tandem with Jamal's. The footage from Gate 3 is clean, audio intact, he said, and we've got time-stamped clips showing Alan making contact before deletion. Compile it with the database flags from HR. Jamal replied, his voice low-focused. Pattern is our strongest evidence. While the media ran wild with speculation and investors scrambled to reposition themselves, Jamal wasn't watching headlines. He was watching the system, how it recorded, hid, and sometimes revealed the truth depending on who was looking. They weren't gathering anecdotes. They were gathering proof. A blinking alert lit up in the corner of the dashboard. Noel tapped it open. Another whistleblower report. From Lydia Grant. She uploaded an audio testimony. 2 minutes long, names included. Timestamps. She saw Tara, Allen, and Kenneth actively try to block passenger validation. Jamal paused. She's credible. Noel nodded. 21 years. Never filed a report before. Her personnel file is clean. She's the one who helped during the disabled vet incident last fall. Add her voice to the witness ledger, Jamal said. Elevate it to Tier 1 relevance. Outside, Zurich's evening sun burned a golden path across the lake. Inside, the walls were lined not with paper or pictures, but with information, rows and rows of patterns, events, names. Systemic neglect dressed as oversight. He clicked into Eastway's historical HR archive. It was slow. purposefully outdated. They're still using the 2016 complaint filtering protocol. Jamal murmured, his brow furrowed. No wonder so much got buried. Noel glanced over. That was designed to deprioritize complaints marked emotional, non-critical, or repetitive, meaning anything made by someone they didn't believe. Jamal muttered. He didn't need rage to stay focused. Rage was inefficient. What he needed now was velocity, calculated, precise. He pulled open the folder marked cross-departmental reports. These were complaint intersections where more than one staff member had been flagged by unrelated passengers for similar behavior. The file was massive. Jamal scrolled slowly. Alan Lawson's name appeared in 6 clusters. Tara Letted's appeared in 5. Kenneth Doyle appeared in 3, with a notation from a compliance officer in 2D22, pattern unconfirmed due to insufficient corroboration. That corroboration was now pouring in. Noel cross-referenced badge logs from the day of the incident. Alan's swipe access shows he skipped bias refresher training last month. Again, flag it, Jamal said. Then came the deeper layer. He opened the Vendor Relations Index. This was the most sensitive document compiled during Eastway's infrastructure partnership negotiations. Hidden within its folds was a clause almost no one in administration had noticed. If an incident triggers internal emergency control, the partner firm may request personnel records for any affiliated vendors or contractors. Roads Dynamics didn't just own a stake in Eastway's systems. It now had the legal right to review everyone connected to it. Jamal turned to Noel. I want the background checks on every staffer who touched this incident. Contractors, too. Find out who hired them, who signed off on promotions, who let the patterns continue. And if we find a common thread, then we know it wasn't personal, Jamal said. It was engineered. In Chicago, an office 4,000 miles from Zurich began lighting up with alerts. Clara Evans, Eastway's external equity consultant and legal liaison, was reviewing the whistleblower submissions one by one. Her jaw tightened as she read the same names, the same stories told by different people across 5 years. She flagged 14 reports for legal escalation. Then she clicked open a folder labeled Redacted Internal Counsel Review 2021. There it was, a suppressed recommendation to reassign Alan Lawson due to cumulative profile inconsistencies. The file had been marked confidential and ignored. Clara's fingers flew across her keyboard. She attached it to a memo addressed to Roads Dynamics Legal, subject suppressed escalation evidence, recommending internal accountability trail to be activated. She hit send. At Eastway, Eli sat in the HR conference room. The air smelled like burnt coffee and stress. Across from him sat a woman in a gray pantsuit named Marcy Dillon, the internal legal investigator brought in to oversee whistleblower debriefings. Eli had never been in a room like this. No phones, no clocks, just questions. You saw Alan tear up Mr. Rhodes's boarding pass, she asked. Yes, Eli said. I saw him look Jamal up and down, then say, you don't belong here. Marcy's pen stopped mid-stroke. Did he say anything else? Eli hesitated. He told security, we've seen people like this sneak in before. Marcy didn't react outwardly, but her eyes darkened. Thank you, Eli. That's consistent with 4 other reports we've now received. She stood and shook his hand. You may have changed more than you realize. Back in Zurich, the final piece arrived. Noel's tablet buzzed. Jamal. We got it. Jamal turned. Noel pulled up a 3-minute security feed from a terminal back hallway dated 30 minutes before the incident. It showed Alan, Kenneth, and Tara in quiet conversation. No audio, but body language was unmistakable. Gestures, nods, a laugh. Then Tara pulled up her screen. Kenneth leaned in. Alan made a slicing motion with his hand. Jamal watched in silence. Pattern confirmed, he said. And with that, the file upload began. System evidence secured. The upload bar ticked toward completion, its final 10% crawling slower than the rest, as if the servers themselves sensed what it meant. Inside the Zurich suite, Jamal stood and walked toward the tall window arms folded loosely. Below him, the Limit River shimmered beneath the fading sun, but his mind wasn't on the skyline. It was on timing. Noel, he said without turning, schedule the executive quorum. Noel didn't need to ask which one. He was already typing. Emergency session. Encrypted. Invite Clara Legal, Ops and Equity Compliance. 30 minutes, Jamal nodded once. Back in Chicago, Clara Evans received the alert while reviewing a batch of internal ethics forms. She didn't wait. Her laptop snapped shut and she grabbed her folder of notes, muttering, "They're not ready for what's coming." Across the city, other alerts began to ping. Legal, HR, vendor oversight. One by one, the decision makers were being gathered not in a courtroom, not in a press conference, but in a digital war room. This wasn't a response. It was a premeditated shift. At 6:32 p.m. Central Time, the quorum began. The virtual screen split into 8 tiles, faces, sharp voices, muted, each one a key player in Eastway's operation. Jamal appeared last, the frame centered on him. No flash, no fanfare, just calm. "Let's begin," he said, "no time for formalities." He didn't review the incident report. Everyone had seen the footage. He didn't open with emotion, he opened with structure. "We've identified recurring patterns of misconduct," he stated. Not isolated, not anecdotal, systemic. He clicked a button. A slideshow began. Slide 1, a cluster map of Eastway complaint data. 5 years, 47 cases, same gate, same personnel. Slide 2, audio transcripts. Phrases like, "You don't belong here." "We've had issues with people like that, and they always cause trouble." Slide 3, suppressed HR recommendations and unresolved warning letters. Noel monitored the sidebar. One participant left the call, an investor likely panicking. Jamal didn't flinch. "We now invoke Section 3 of the Equity Enforcement Clause." Jamal continued, voice even. "We are forming an internal reform strike team with full authority to restructure the operational code at Eastway." Clara leaned forward. "I'll head the policy revision committee, but we'll need direct authorization to bypass old clearance layers." "You'll have it in 24 hours, Jamal confirmed. Another executive, Marcia Lynn from Vendor Oversight, raised a hand. "Do we have legal coverage?" Jamal nodded toward Noel, who shared the contract on screen. Clause 1A, emergency control. Reputational threat escalation. We're within range. And just like that, the first quiet line of battle had been drawn. But it wouldn't end there. 10 minutes later, while most of Eastway's passengers enjoyed their flights, the staff began noticing subtle changes. First, system messages prompted mandatory re-verification of every shift manager's credentials. Then gate access cards began blinking yellow instead of green, a signal only tech and HR recognized. Security teams received anonymous memos marked Policy Audit Phase 1. Inside, bullet-pointed checklists outlined behavior protocol assessments, demographic equity tracking, and hidden observer reports. They weren't asking permission. They were laying a trap for misconduct, for negligence, for every shortcut taken under assumed immunity. Isham. Back at the Zurich suite, Jamal leaned against the desk. "We'll use silence," he said to Noel. "No announcement, no grand reveal. Let their discomfort be the first signal." Noel smiled slightly. "Ghost mode, exactly. Audit them without a headline." Jamal's strategy wasn't to expose, it was to corner. Every action would lead to only one possible conclusion: admit fault or vanish. He turned back to the screen, eyes scanning a live stream of gate camera feeds. People moved normally, boarding, waiting, greeting loved ones. But beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of control were shifting. At Eastway's lower-level maintenance hub, a man named Sam Ellis, one of the airport's few black senior engineers, received an email with a subject line that simply read "Private." He opened it, blinking. Inside was a direct request from Roads Dynamics. Would he be willing to review Eastway's internal staff rotation data for bias patterns off the record? Sam's eyes widened. He'd been fighting that exact problem for 3 years. He tapped a reply. "Consider it done." Sure. Meanwhile, in a suburban house on Chicago's north side, a woman named Marlene, who had filed a racial profiling complaint against Alan Lawson 3 years earlier, only to be gaslit and silenced, received a call from a number marked "Private." She answered cautiously. "Hello." A woman's voice spoke clearly. "Marlene, this is Clara Evans. We've reopened your case, and this time it won't disappear." There was a pause. Then Marlene whispered, "It's about time." Strategic moves didn't come with fireworks. They came with paper trails. and Jamal was building a map of them all. The next morning, an internal alert appeared on Eastway's staff dashboard. Not public, not visible to travelers. Subject: Operational Culture Integrity Review. 72-hour phase audit begins now. Below it, a list of new protocols appeared. Anonymous interviews required. All audio logs from passenger interactions to be archived. Ongoing behavior scoring via live training assistant. Staff must report bias signals from coworkers without delay. Hidden within the message metadata was a tag initiated by R Dynamics with a equity mode alpha. The walls were closing in, and no one could scream for help without revealing themselves. Jamal didn't need the spotlight. He was turning the system against itself. The doors to Eastway International's director's wing slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the tension could have been sliced with a boarding pass. Martin Hensley, the airport's longtime director, stood stiffly behind his desk. His phone screen still glowed with the red-tinted notification, Audit Authority transferred. He hadn't slept. He hadn't shaved. But above all, he hadn't understood until now. Across from him sat Clara Evans. Her black blazer was buttoned to the collar, her tone precise. "She wasn't here to negotiate. This isn't a courtesy visit, Martin," she said coolly. "This is a confrontation. We've given your office 3 hours to comply. So far, you've stalled twice and denied direct access to the audit interface." Martin gestured vaguely at his assistant, who stood ghost pale near the coffee machine. "We're trying. These systems are, look, it's complex." Clara set a folder on the desk. "What's complex is explaining why security footage of racial profiling incidents went missing for 6 separate complaints filed between January and July." She flipped the folder open. "Gate 3C, 2 incidents, both logged in the system, but the video files were erased. Who had clearance?" Martin opened his mouth to deflect, but a knock interrupted. The door creaked open. A new figure stepped inside, Desmond Tate, just appointed head of security the previous night. Tall, broad-shouldered, calm. He didn't wait for permission. "We traced the deletions," Desmond said, placing a drive on the desk. "They were remotely wiped by Supervisor Alan Lawson. He used a ghost admin profile last accessed from this office." Martin's face drained. "That's impossible. I didn't authorize that." Desmond didn't flinch. "No one said you did, but the activity log has your terminal ID, and Clara has the chain of command logs." Clara didn't need to say anything more. Her presence spoke with every second of silence that followed. Martin looked between them, realizing finally that the insulation he'd always counted on had burned away. His alliances quiet, his excuses logged. Every denial now sharpened the blade at his own neck. Meanwhile, at Security Base 6, Jamal Roads stepped into the room without announcement. Officer Brent looked up halfway through pouring a coffee he suddenly forgot he wanted. His badge hung slightly askew, and his usual arrogance had wilted into something sweatier. Jamal didn't shout. He simply held up a folded paper, the disciplinary request Clara had filed just hours ago. Brent's name was underlined in red. "You signed off on Alan's detainment protocol," Jamal said. "Even after seeing my ID, correct?" Brent opened his mouth. "You also allowed my duffel to be searched in public without consent in violation of TSA regulations." "Correct," Brent nodded slowly. "And you mocked the customer service rep, who recognized me from Business Leaders Monthly, telling him, quote, 'Don't believe hype from YouTube billionaires.' Do I have that quote right?" Brent's mouth moved. No words came out. Jamal didn't press further. "Turn in your badge, effective immediately." Brent looked around as if expecting someone to intervene, but the other officers nearby didn't move. Some wouldn't even meet his eyes. In Jamal's calm, there was something sharper than fury. There was certainty. Brent pulled his badge from his chest and laid it on the counter with a soft click. That click echoed louder than any siren. At the same time, on the main floor of Terminal C, the murmurs began. Passengers waiting in line glanced up at the large monitor mounted above the information desk. Usually it showed weather maps or delayed flights. But today the feed had changed. A message appeared: Eastway Systems Audit in progress. Notice: reforms underway. Dignity is now policy. Beneath it, 3 real-time counters ticked forward. 1. Employees suspended for bias violations. 7. 2. Pending terminations under Review 3. 3. Passenger equity investigations reopened 21. And below that, a final line report misconduct. Changes watching. People stared. Some raised phones. Others clapped quietly. One elderly black man near the window wiped a tear from his cheek. Back near the security lanes, Eli, the young employee who had first recognized Jamal, stood quietly. A hand tapped his shoulder. He turned. It was Jamal. "You spoke up when it mattered," Jamal said. "That's leadership." Eli blinked. I thought I got in the way." "You got in the way of silence," Jamal replied. "That's exactly where you're needed." He handed Eli a slip of paper, an internal elevation request form, with a handwritten note, training recommendation fast-track program. Equity Leadership Pathway. Eli's eyes widened. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say it by staying," Jamal answered, "and by fixing what they broke." On the upper concourse, Clara was now in full motion. Her team streamed through the back offices of HR, collecting data logs, unearthing buried complaints, rerouting whistleblower messages that had once been silenced. Desmond followed behind, overseeing reassignments. Security personnel were reshuffled based on track record, not tenure. The old buddy system broken. At 3:44 p.m., an official memo went live. From Jamal Roads, CEO, Roads Dynamics, to all Eastway staff. "You may not have caused this problem, but if you're not ready to fix it, you're not ready to stay." Effective immediately, all staff will be evaluated under Roads Dynamics conduct and integrity standards. Compliance is not optional. Culture is not negotiable. Let the record reflect, we didn't escalate. We restored. By sunset, the airport was buzzing, but not with anger, with awareness. The old rules whispered biases, selective security, the quiet humiliation of passengers who didn't look the part, were dying fast. And Jamal, he wasn't done. The confrontation wasn't just about personnel, it was about a mirror. And today, everyone had to look into it. By dawn, the next morning, Eastway International was no longer operating as an airport. It was functioning as a live case study of collapse. Not the kind seen in disaster films, but the more dangerous kind, the quiet disintegration of a corrupt internal culture under the pressure of transparency. It began with a memo. Subject: immediate suspension of legacy clearance systems. At 6:04 a.m., every outdated clearance badge issued before the Roads Dynamics infrastructure partnership was revoked. Across terminals, supervisors accustomed to breezing through restricted areas found themselves locked out, standing awkwardly in front of blinking red scanners. The system hadn't crashed, it had evolved without them. Kenneth Lyall, the former deputy director of operations, was one of the first casualties. He arrived in his pressed uniform and outdated confidence, only to find his access to the operations floor revoked. He tried his office next, locked. Even his internal email account had been deactivated. A printed notice taped to his door read, "Pending investigation, Barnum. Do not enter without clearance." Kenneth stared at it for a long time, jaw-tight, hands trembling at his sides. He turned, half expecting someone to explain it was all a mistake, but no one came. Staff passed by, eyes averted, the silence thicker than any accusation. Just down the corridor, Tara Ledded sat in a conference room across from two Roads Dynamics auditors. Her shoulders slumped. Her makeup looked like it had been applied too hastily, trying to mask the fatigue of someone who hadn't slept. In front of her was a list: 12 documented instances of inappropriate service denial based on customer appearance or perceived status. Each one had a timestamp. Some included video. All of them had her name attached. "We're not here to destroy you," the lead auditor said, voice measured. "But the truth has already decided what gets erased. All we're doing now is documenting it." Tara stared at the page. "I didn't mean to discriminate," she mumbled. The auditor tapped a finger near one line, a comment Tara had left in a staff chat about spotting fakes by the way they dressed. "Intent doesn't erase impact," the auditor replied, "and patterns don't lie." Tara said nothing. She didn't argue. She just lowered her head and signed the acknowledgement form. In that moment, the weight of her own legacy, the kind built on unexamined habits, settled around her like a cold fog. Meanwhile, the media had begun to feast. Footage from the original incident, Jamal's boarding denial and detainment, had gone viral overnight. Spliced with social commentary and expert analysis, it trended across platforms under the hashtag #TicketTornTruth. Civil rights lawyers, tech analysts, and aviation industry veterans all weighed in. Most were stunned by one thing: the silence of Roads Dynamics. No press release, no media tour, just action. "This isn't crisis management," one news anchor remarked. "This is systemic correction at jet speed." Jamal, true to form, remained unseen, but not inactive. From his temporary operations suite inside the old Eastway Communications hub, he oversaw the quiet dismantling of the airport's core hierarchy. Vendor contracts were frozen for review. Payments flagged for conflict of interest were routed to legal, and then came the personnel audit. Each staff member was assigned a code based on their conduct history: green clear, yellow monitored, red flagged. By noon, nearly 17% of the airport's supervisory staff had been placed under review. At 12:38 p.m., something no one expected happened. The Eastern Terminal's internal servers, still operated by the old IT management team, crashed. For 30 minutes, all boarding gates in that wing went down. Hundreds of passengers stood idling as monitors flickered and gate agents scrambled. In the control tower, Noel's team activated a backup protocol Jamal had designed personally. Within 7 minutes, the entire Eastern Terminal was rebooted through Roads Dynamics' cloud-based systems, bypassing the legacy server entirely. The crash had revealed something critical: Eastway's bones were crumbling beneath its glossy surface. And Jamal had the blueprints to rebuild it one protocol at a time. Back in the main terminal, Clara Evans convened a closed-door meeting with all remaining department heads. Her voice was calm but implacable. "The collapse isn't coming. It's here," she said, pointing to a live dashboard displaying compliance failures in real time. "You have two choices: defend the old model or join the rebuild. Defend it, and you will lose quietly and permanently. Join us, and you may survive, but not as who you were. That version of you is already obsolete." Not one person in the room spoke, but the looks on their faces said everything. Power had shifted, and it wasn't going back. By mid-afternoon, passengers began to feel the difference. A black mother with two toddlers was escorted personally to a family-friendly waiting area by a gate agent wearing a Respect First badge. A Sikh man with a turban passed through security without being stopped for random checks for the first time in years. An elderly Chinese woman received assistance in Mandarin without being ignored or rushed. These were small moments, but together they felt like a tectonic shift, a shift built on the rubble of the old. That evening, as the sun dipped below the runway skyline, Jamal stood near a security window, hands in his pockets watching a plane take off. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, but he did breathe deeper. Beside him, Noel held a new report: 27 terminations pending, 43 compliance retrainings ordered. Audit committee is asking if we want to release a public summary. Jamal shook his head. "Not yet. Let the silence carry." "Silence?" Noel asked, surprised. Jamal turned to him. "When the system collapses, the silence tells us who heard it fall." And across Eastway, everyone had heard it, some with fear, others with relief, but all with certainty: the old airport was gone, and in its place something new had begun to rise. The following morning, Eastway International did not feel like the same place. There were no dramatic banners, no press conferences, no security sweeps. No one issued a formal apology or printed new slogans. But the airport felt different, as if the structure itself had been scrubbed of something invisible and corrosive. The tension so long stitched into the walls like a hidden wire had vanished. At 7:12 a.m., the first visible sign of change arrived in the form of a small, rectangular sticker. "Respect is standard." It was affixed beneath the nameplates of the check-in desks and gate counters. By noon, it was everywhere. At Terminal C, a mother traveling with her autistic son received quiet, informed assistance from the two staff members who didn't rush her, didn't sigh, didn't speak over her son. Just calm help. At security, an elderly man in a wheelchair was not told to wait indefinitely while staff figured things out. Instead, a manager personally escorted him through a side clearance line, making sure he understood every step. The behaviors weren't rehearsed, they weren't even coordinated. They were simply real. At the center of it all, the control tower ran smoother than ever. New staffing rotations had begun under an experimental model drafted by Desmond Tate, the newly appointed Director of Airport Security. His first mandate stripped all staff of permanent privilege. Every 6 months, every employee, regardless of rank, would undergo a full performance and behavior review by a mixed panel of colleagues and outside observers. It wasn't punitive, it was structural. No more hiding behind tenure. Desmond, a quiet man in his 50s with Air Force decorum and clear eyes, walked the terminals himself. Not to inspect, but to observe. He paused to thank janitorial staff. He took notes during interactions between agents and passengers. When approached by a young officer with questions, he listened without cutting them off. Leadership, he said, starts with shutting up and watching who the room listens to when you're not talking. Elsewhere, the digital systems Jamal had quietly rerouted remained under internal audit. Roads Dynamics had not officially claimed ownership of the airport. They hadn't even issued a press release. But the reality was undeniable. The heartbeat of Eastway now pulsed through Jamal's architecture. Vendors previously protected by outdated contracts were either renegotiating or quietly exiting. The cafeteria, once operated by a firm whose CEO had referred to non-English speakers as service delays, was replaced with a cooperative-style model. Employees ate for free during high-volume shifts. The quality of service improved by 28% in 2 days. And then something unexpected happened. The mural appeared. No one announced it. No ribbon was cut. It simply showed up one morning, stretching the entire east wall of the central atrium. Painted in long, storm-colored strokes of blue-gray and ochre gold, it depicted a man standing calmly in a black hoodie, unmoved at the center of chaos. Around him, torn tickets, swirling dust, scattered light. No name, no plaque, just a single word engraved beneath the image in stone rise. Passengers stopped to stare. Some took photos. Others stood silently for minutes. One little boy asked his mother, "Is that the man who made the airport kind?" She didn't know how to answer. In the operations suite, Jamal sat alone. The Zurich presentation had gone as planned. Investors were aligned. The urban infrastructure proposal had been greenlit. But none of that occupied his thoughts today. Instead, he was reading reports, customer testimonials submitted voluntarily over the past week. Some were single sentences. Others were essays. Many began the same way. "I never thought I'd feel respected at an airport." Noel entered quietly holding a tablet. "We just received an external audit rating from the Federal Compliance Division." Jamal looked up. "Clean," Noel said simply. "Not just clean, commendable. Highest ethics index ever recorded for a transportation hub of this size." Jamal nodded once. He closed the file in his hands and stood. He walked to the glass, looking down at the tarmac below. A family was boarding. The father carried a sleeping toddler. The gate agent smiled and waved them through without rushing. "I didn't expect it to move this fast," Noel said beside him. Jamal shook his head. "It didn't move fast. It was always ready. We just got the weight off the brakes." Across the airport, the changes weren't just procedural. They were cultural. A shift in tone in how problems were solved, how people were treated. There were no buzzwords, no diversity posters, just actions. And the strangest thing of all, the passengers noticed. They didn't need to know about Jamal's silent takeover. They didn't need to hear boardroom resolutions or internal memos. They could feel it. In the way someone said, "Welcome aboard," and meant it. In the way nobody asked for IDs based on assumptions. In the way silence had been replaced not by noise, but by dignity. Not a single executive had resigned publicly. Not a single fired employee had sued. But the ecosystem had rearranged itself around a new gravitational center. The weight of assumption had collapsed, and in its place was breath. Ease. Rebirth. Not loud, not viral, but permanent. The shift at Eastway International wasn't limited to smiles and cleaner terminals. It reached deeper into the foundation of authority compliance and the very architecture of power that had gone unquestioned for years. Within 48 hours of Jamal's silent invocation of the emergency clause, every Eastway division had undergone a forensic internal audit. Not just personnel files and customer complaints, but full reviews of procedural loopholes, ignored reports, and whistleblower suppressions. What emerged was an ecosystem built to deflect blame upward while hiding bias laterally. No single act had caused the rot. It had been systemic neglect, one layer at a time. The executive board of Eastway Holdings convened an emergency session on the third day. Not at their usual location, the top floor of the Lexington building, but in a smaller, unadorned conference room directly above Terminal B. Jamal insisted. If they wanted to see the consequence of their decisions, they should hear it echo from the very halls where those decisions landed. The session opened with silence. Most board members sat uncomfortably unsure if they were there to be briefed, scolded, or fired. But Jamal's tone when he finally spoke was clinical, not furious. He projected data, complaint escalation failures, gaps in security protocol reviews, logged usage of discretionary removal powers. Each stat was paired with a name not to shame but to show traceability. No system fails by accident, he said. It fails by design or by willful ignorance. By hour 2, 3 directors had offered verbal resignations. By hour 3, 2 more had been placed on review. The compliance chief, a man named Carrick Hume, who had signed off on the last 5 internal bias dismissals, requested time to respond. Jamal declined. Time was your luxury. Now it belongs to those you failed. Simultaneously, departmental restructuring began across Eastway. Entire lines of authority were flattened. Gate supervisors were given more discretion to flag systemic abuse. A new equity accountability officer, independent of HR and directly tied to passenger rights groups, was created. And every hiring manager was temporarily removed from duty until they completed external training. The consequences weren't just inside the building. The Federal Transportation Ethics Commission requested a full report. Civil rights organizations called for audits in other cities. 3 major airlines reevaluated their terminal security contracts, looking into Roads Dynamics compliance modules as a potential replacement for legacy oversight models. The ripple had become a wave. Outside the airport, media coverage exploded, not about the discrimination incident, but about the response. Headlines read, "CEO rewrites airport ethics code from inside out." Others asked, "Is this the new model for corporate justice?" Stock in Roads Dynamics quietly ticked upward. Not from investor hype, but from institutional confidence. Jamal, however, remained unseen. He never returned to the boardroom after that 3rd hour. His role wasn't punishment, it was realignment. And now that the architecture had been reset, his work was pivoting elsewhere. As he told Noel late one evening while reviewing footage of improved check-in interactions, consequences aren't the end. They're the groundwork. Now we see what grows. The next morning, Eastway International felt eerily quiet, not because the crowds were gone far from it, but because the usual undercurrent of chaos had been replaced by an unnerving calm. Gone were the clipped orders shouted across security lines. No loud reprimands, no rushed apologies. Something deeper had shifted, something unspoken. Jamal Roads hadn't said a word to the press. No formal address, no declaration of control, but his presence was everywhere. Screens once reserved for flight updates now rotated through a quiet message, "Respect is standard operational reform in progress." Below it, a subtle Roads Dynamics insignia pulsed softly. Within the airport's HR division, meetings that were usually brief and procedural had turned intense and long. Brent, the officer who had rifled through Jamal's bag, now sat across from a legal investigator with a notepad and a flat expression. His badge sat face down on the table. No scolding, just silence and pen strokes. "You participated in the detainment of a verified investor without following identity protocol." "Explain," the interviewer said. Brent stammered, I followed the gate supervisor's lead. I was just doing my job. Your job doesn't include profiling." The pen didn't stop. "Continue." In the security division's main operations room, a new face had taken over the director's chair. Desmond Tate, calm and immovable, had begun reviewing hours of archived security footage, noting patterns not just from the incident with Jamal, but dozens of microaggressions, biases, and unexplained detainments over the past 6 months. Most involved young black men, elderly immigrants, or travelers with non-Western surnames. "Pull every shift log tied to those incidents," he told the analyst beside him. "Cross-check it with the HR complaint index. And I want audio too." We're not just replacing names, we're replacing behavior. At the terminal entrance, guests arriving for their flights were greeted with an unexpected sight: uniformed staff standing in line waiting to be called for retraining. Many looked confused, others uncomfortable. Their supervisors had been temporarily suspended pending review, and a team from Roads Dynamics Leadership Academy had been flown in overnight to begin active bias training. Meanwhile, Jamal stayed away from the terminals. His work happened from a private control center 2 miles off-site where screens tracked real-time employee conduct metrics, service satisfaction ratings, and complaint escalation patterns. Every algorithm used in Roads Dynamics infrastructure projects had been repurposed for personnel evaluation. One screen caught his eye, a live feed of the airport lounge where a woman in a tan blazer approached a desk with her boarding pass. The attendant, a man in his 40s, hesitated, then smiled and waved her through. No pause, no question. The algorithm noted it. Green light. Another feed. A young black man in a hoodie nearly Jamal's double stepped into the business class line. The attendant there froze slightly, scanned the pass, then nodded. But the hesitation had registered. A yellow alert. Not disciplinary, but instructional. Jamal tapped the screen. Add this to the retraining session. Identify the moment hesitation replaces instinct. At the same moment in a quiet airport cafe, Alan Lawson sat alone. His face was sunken, shirt wrinkled, and phone screen cracked. His access had been revoked. His pension temporarily frozen pending investigation. He wasn't allowed to enter the main concourse. For the first time, he was not only powerless, but invisible. Across from him, his former deputy Lyle sat nursing a coffee, eyes down. It's all flipped, Lyle mumbled. Alan didn't respond. You think he'll press charges? Alan flinched. He doesn't have to. Outside the window, the mural in the atrium now showed Jamal not posing like a CEO, but standing calmly in his hoodie, hands in his pockets, surrounded by abstract storms rendered in brilliant color. Underneath it, the carved words still glowed, rise. Elsewhere in the airport, junior staff who had been ignored for years were now being approached for insight. Eli, the young employee who tried to speak up, had been promoted to assistant guest experience coordinator. He now sat in meetings with people twice his age. His voice, once dismissed, was suddenly policy. I remember what it felt like when I saw Jamal, he said in a morning huddle. I knew who he was. I didn't have the rank to stop what happened, but I spoke up. That's what changed me. The others nodded. Leadership now meant more than tenure. It meant seeing clearly. Back in Zurich, Jamal scrolled through the latest personnel shift report. 14 demotions, 7 promotions, 3 resignations, 1 reinstatement with conditions. The system had been shaken, but now it was recalibrating. He closed the laptop and stood, hands in his pockets, facing the sunrise. When he first entered Eastway, they saw a hoodie, a problem, a deviation. Now the hoodie had become a symbol not of rebellion, but of reckoning. A silent power had spoken, and the structure had finally listened. Desmond Tate's shoes didn't squeak. They thudded softly, steadily, as he walked the length of the Eastway operations corridor just after sunrise. He didn't wear a badge, didn't carry a clipboard, didn't bark orders. But every employee who passed him stood a little straighter. Not because of fear, because of change. Because they knew the system that protected negligence had cracked, and Desmond was the man now sealing the gaps. At 58, Desmond had seen every kind of dysfunction a public system could produce. He'd commanded air bases overseas, led risk reform in South American terminals, and helped digitize refugee processing in Jordan. But nothing had prepared him for what he found at Eastway, a culture that didn't just ignore bias it fed on, it disguised it as policy and called it procedure. Leadership starts with the first eye contact, he often said. And this morning, as he stepped into the Level 2 briefing room, that philosophy would become law. Across the room sat 8 new department heads, some promoted, some reassigned, all selected for one reason: conscience. These weren't the longest tenured or the loudest. These were the ones who had raised red flags quietly, who had filed the complaints no one followed up on, who had once been told to stay in their lane. He stood at the front, hands behind his back. We are not rebuilding from scratch, Desmond began. We're rebuilding with memory. Every mistake this airport has made, every silence that let it happen, will inform what comes next. Juliana Ruiz, newly appointed Director of Passenger Equity, raised her hand. Are we operating under Jamal's direct oversight? Desmond shook his head. No, we're operating under Jamal's vision, and his expectation that we build something sustainable without his constant presence. That drew nods around the room. Everyone had seen the footage, the silent removal of corrupted staff, the red list, the mural. But Jamal had disappeared after Zurich. No statements, no interviews, just a ripple effect that was still expanding. Desmond tapped a tablet, projecting a chart onto the wall. "This is the new decision framework," he said. "Every policy change goes through this impact, equity, accountability." Juliana leaned forward. "And if it fails one, then it doesn't happen." On the chart were four verticals: security, guest experience, vendor relations, and internal HR. Each now had its own oversight subcommittee, half staff, half community. No more closed-door directives. Every policy affecting traveler treatment would be reviewed by real passengers, some flown in at the airport's expense. Desmond turned to Jamal's old assistant, Noel, who had been appointed interim VP of Cultural Systems. Noel walked them through the first reform. Noel stood. He was younger than the rest, mid-30s, but his presence had matured in the past week. Effective immediately, every complaint filed at Eastway triggers a mandatory response within 24 hours. Not a form letter, a call, a review, a record. Staff will be rotated based on pattern analysis, not just schedule. No more hiding behind bureaucracy. Juliana asked, "What happens to those who resist?" Desmond didn't blink. "They resist once. Then they retrain. If they resist again, they resign. No exceptions." The room was quiet, not tense-focused. That afternoon, Desmond walked the terminal, not as a superior, but as a mirror. He approached gate agents mid-shift, asked what tools they needed. He sat with custodial staff during their break, listened to stories of who had once dismissed them. He met with tech engineers in the old server room and reviewed footage flagging facial recognition mismatches. By evening, the changes were visible. Security checkpoints now displayed posters, not with rules, but with rights. You have the right to be treated with dignity. If you are not, here's where to report it. Kiosks offered live support chats for complaints staffed by real people, not bots. Bathrooms had feedback panels linked directly to HR. And in the food court, a chalkboard wall invited travelers to write one thing they wished airports understood. By sundown, it was covered. "I am more than my accent. Stop assuming my dad can't afford this ticket. See me." In a small conference room near Gate 9, Juliana met with Lydia Grant, the silver-braided teller who had been one of the first to recognize Jamal that day. Now promoted to Community Oversight Liaison, Lydia reviewed every flagged incident alongside Juliana. Together, they built training modules based on real encounters. "We're not teaching people how to behave," Lydia said. "We're reminding them how to recognize another human being." In a quiet hallway, a new staffer stopped Desmond. "Sir, I've only been here a week. I came because I saw the story. I just wanted to ask, how do we know this change will last?" Desmond didn't smile, but he didn't look away. "Because this time it didn't come from PR. It came from pain, and pain doesn't forget." Across the city, news outlets reported on Eastway's leadership changes with cautious optimism. Some called it performative. Others called it precedent-setting. But those inside the airport felt something real, something permanent. For the first time in years, Eastway wasn't just being run, it was being led. The echo of transformation rang louder inside Eastway's command center than any announcement ever could. Gone were the old laminated charts of duty rotations and outdated policy memos pinned to corkboards. In their place stood a 10-foot digital display alive with dynamic dashboards, metrics of respect, accountability, and responsiveness. Jamal Roads hadn't just replaced people, he had rewritten the rules. The Fair Flight Protocol, now mandatory airport-wide, was Eastway's institutional keystone. It wasn't about image, it was about systems. Codified into every shift terminal and training room, it marked the airport's rebirth. Desmond Tate, Lydia Grant, Juliana Ruiz, and Noel worked side by side to ensure it wasn't symbolic. It was operational, real, measurable. "I don't want slogans," Desmond had told the Reform Committee. "I want safeguards." Under Fair Flight, every single employee interaction from check-in to lost luggage to security hold was recorded, rated, and archived. Not for punishment, but for patterns. Patterns that had once gone ignored were now red flags. Every complaint triggered three things: investigation, response, and policy review. At the heart of this system was a radical innovation, the Passenger Integrity Board. Composed of rotating citizens, veteran travelers, retired airline staff, and equity officers, the board reviewed anonymized weekly footage. If they saw biased misconduct or passive neglect, that clip was flagged. And if the behavior repeated, the responsible employee entered a mandatory rehabilitation program. No warning needed, no manager approval required. The system enforced itself. It didn't take long for the staff to realize the airport wasn't watching them. The people were. Terminal B's training center was unrecognizable. What had once been a beige room with plastic chairs was now a theater-style auditorium with interactive modules, VR stations, and role-play zones. Noel, now interim VP of Cultural Systems, had designed it with one goal: confrontation through immersion. "You don't learn equity from a slideshow," he said during the pilot orientation. "You learn it from discomfort." Trainees were placed in real scenarios from past cases: a black traveler in a hoodie misjudged at check-in, an elderly man mistaken for disruptive because of an accent, a Muslim woman stared at through security. "No rewind," the instructor would say. "Decide, react, learn." Mistakes weren't punished in training, but they were dissected with peers on camera. Every action came with reflection. It was grueling, but effective. Juliana Ruiz revamped onboarding with the same intensity. Her equity entry program was mandatory for all hires, no matter rank. From janitors to jet bridge supervisors, everyone spent 3 days off-site. "No uniforms, no name tags, just humanity," she said. Staff would volunteer in local shelters, attend oral history workshops from marginalized communities, and sit through empathy immersion labs. The goal wasn't pity. It was presence. If they couldn't sit in someone else's silence, they couldn't serve their journey. Juliana wasn't satisfied with attendance sheets. She tracked outcomes: how often those employees were named in compliments or complaints, how they handled conflict months later. Within 4 weeks of launching, Fairflight traveler incidents dropped 67%. Not because people behaved better, but because the system refused to excuse them. You couldn't delete footage. You couldn't override reviews. Truth had a seat at the table now, and it brought receipts. Vendors were not exempt. Jamal had written contracts that included human dignity clauses. Catering, cleaning, shuttle services, all were required to adhere to the same equity standards. Failure to do so resulted in automatic termination of partnership. And it wasn't empty threat. One catering service that delayed halal meals due to complicated timing found its trucks banned the next morning. Their CEO issued a public apology. Then attended training. Even architecture changed. Quiet rooms were added near every terminal, places for prayer, decompression, or simply to breathe. Language access booths were placed at major intersections. Signage was updated to include visual aids for neurodivergent passengers. The airport had become not just inclusive, but anticipatory. Desmond received a report showing 82% of employees felt more seen under the new system. Still, he wasn't satisfied. "We won't measure success by silence," he told his leadership team. "We'll measure it by the courage to speak." So Eastway launched the Red Button app, a mobile feature embedded in the airport Wi-Fi. One tap let a traveler or staff member record an interaction and submit it for review. No account needed, no identity exposed. In 1 week, 374 submissions came through. Most were positive. Some revealed cracks. All were heard. The old Eastway had been an airport with gates. The new Eastway was a system with windows. And on every window, etched in subtle lettering, was one line: "Respect isn't granted, it's built." The days that followed the airport's silent transformation were unlike anything Eastway had experienced in its history. There were no marketing campaigns, no grand statements from leadership. Instead, the public began to notice. Word of mouth replaced advertising. Stories whispered at dinner tables, posted in community forums, and shared on social media painted a picture of something more powerful than PR change felt. A mother flying alone with her toddler reported that a security officer offered to help carry her stroller, not as a favor but as policy. An elderly man who had flown through Eastway for decades was stunned when a young gate agent addressed him by name, thanked him for his loyalty, and offered to walk him to his gate. He posted about it on his Facebook page, the post going viral in local circles with the caption, "Feels like someone finally listened." The hashtag Eastway changed quietly trended, not because the airport pushed it, but because travelers did. Stories began to pour in, not of flashy renovations, but of quiet respect. A teenager who once dreaded TSA lines wrote about being treated with kindness by a newly hired staff member. A woman in a hijab noted she was pulled aside not for additional screening, but to be offered assistance after she appeared overwhelmed by a long layover. Every story was different, but each one pointed to the same undercurrent. Something fundamental had shifted at Eastway. Jamal, still in Zurich, watched the ripples from afar. He had not returned to the airport. He had not granted interviews. Instead, he reviewed data. Customer feedback scores had climbed higher than they had in 5 years. Complaint rates had dropped by half. But what mattered most to him were the stories. He instructed Noel to compile the testimonials not for corporate review, but for internal training. People deserve to see the impact of their work, he said, not through charts, but through lived experience. Noel quietly set up a new system in Eastway's internal communication platform, a daily feed that showcased one passenger story per shift. It was optional reading. Yet within a week, every staff member had read every single entry. Some printed them, some taped them to break room walls. Then something unexpected happened. Local schools began reaching out to request tours, not just of planes, but of operations. Teachers wanted students to see what systemic accountability looked like in real time. Community organizations, long skeptical of Eastway's biases, now requested meetings about partnership opportunities. A coalition for immigrant advocacy asked to collaborate on traveler support stations. Eastway, once the subject of quiet complaints and online rants, was becoming a model. Not because Jamal marketed it that way, but because transparency and humility replaced ego and silence. A local radio host who had criticized the airport for years opened her Monday show with a different tone. "Something's different," she said, addressing her audience. "I'm not saying it's perfect, but I walked through Terminal B last night, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I mattered." The phone lines lit up. Caller after caller shared similar observations. One described a TSA officer who apologized for a delay. Another mentioned a janitor who offered directions with a smile. A third caller, a woman who used a wheelchair, said she was shocked when 3 staff members coordinated to help her to the gate without her even asking. The city began to take notice. At a town hall meeting, Eastway's new director of equity and operations, Desmond Tate, appeared as a guest speaker. He didn't bring a slideshow. He didn't quote metrics. Instead, he read aloud 5 stories from recent passengers. After each one, he paused. The silence in the room was louder than applause. One city council member, previously skeptical of airport investments, stood up after the presentation. "I've always measured success in dollars," he admitted. "But what you've shown tonight is that dignity might be the better metric." By the end of the week, local newspapers ran op-eds titled, "When an Airport Becomes a Mirror and the Power of Quiet Change." Eastway became more than a travel hub. It became a case study. Professors from nearby universities incorporated it into curriculum. Graduate students requested access to anonymized data for thesis projects. And yet no one had yet heard from the man who made it all possible. Jamal refused invitations to panels, declined speaking engagements, and ignored media outreach. Instead, he asked that frontline staff receive the credit. He redirected awards to department heads. When a major aviation magazine tried to put him on the cover, he replied simply, "Put Lydia on it. She was the first to act." That cover hit newsstands 2 weeks later. Lydia Grant, in her regional equity officer badge, stood humbly by a boarding gate. The caption read, "Leadership isn't a title. It's a decision." And the public, they didn't just take note, they showed up. Passenger volume increased by 12%. Loyalty card applications spiked. Families who once drove extra miles to avoid Eastway now booked directly through it. Public awakening, it turned out, didn't require banners or chants, just truth, trust, and consistency. The kind that began with silence and ended in respect. 3 days after the Eastway control transfer, something unexpected began to happen, not at the airport, but in boardrooms, newsrooms, and private Slack channels across the global aviation industry. At a luxury hotel ballroom in Dubai, executives from Aerodyne Logistics had gathered for an annual strategic planning retreat. The mood had been upbeat until a junior VP brought up an unlisted video that had quietly gone viral. No press release, no hashtags, just a clip sequence of security footage, a boarding pass being torn in half, a black man calmly escorted out, and then a system-wide takeover. Silence fell over the table as the footage played. When it ended, the chairman turned to the group and said only, "Find out who else we've ignored." At Heathrow, a director of compliance forwarded a confidential memo to the CEO marked, "Urgent reevaluate our minority profiling protocols." Reference Eastway audit fallout. At LAX, a contractor paused mid-negotiation and asked quietly, "You think they'd ever try that here?" No one answered. And at a tech conference in Singapore, a slide from a keynote address suddenly featured a new name under Most Disruptive Innovators of 2025, Jamal Roads. No explanation. Just a black hoodie icon and a line that read, "Reform doesn't shout, it restructures." The shift wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, but it was spreading. Aviation forums lit up with debate. Can an investor actually assume operational control of an airport? Is Roads Dynamics about to build its own airline? Did anyone else notice who got promoted at Eastway? What began as whispers became the undercurrent of every strategic call. CEOs who dismissed equity policies as PR boxes now ask consultants for emergency diversity audits. Training firms specializing in anti-bias instruction saw a 70% uptick in inquiries. But it wasn't just fear, it was realization. The industry had always responded to crashes mechanical, procedural PR disasters. But Jamal hadn't caused a crash. He'd initiated a recalibration. And it frightened people because it worked. One particularly rattled executive at North Star Terminals ordered a full systems check of passenger treatment logs over the past 5 years. The results left him stunned. Discrepancies in how black and brown travelers were flagged, detained, denied, or dismissed. Quiet patterns hidden under policy language and unchecked bias. He forwarded the report to legal and added a note. If Roads sees this, we're done. Meanwhile, investors were taking note. Roads Dynamics stock surged quietly, gaining $1.3 billion in valuation over 5 days. Not because of hype, but because of trust. Investors saw in Jamal not just a businessman, but a systems architect, someone who didn't wait for the law to catch up, someone who built his own law into the infrastructure. At a startup accelerator in Austin, a black founder pitched a transport logistics tool. Half the room was distracted until he dropped one name inspired by Jamal Roads. Every eye snapped forward. He got funding on the spot. In Brussels, a think tank held a roundtable titled "Silent Power, the Eastway Shift in What It Means for Transatlantic Infrastructure." None of the panelists worked at Eastway, but all referenced it. The tone wasn't speculation, it was study. And then came the internal calls. From Seattle to Seoul, HR heads were summoned into meetings not to discuss recruitment, but retention. What happens if our own Jamal gets profiled at check-in? Do we even know who's sitting in our back rows at a boutique firm in Atlanta? An intern posted a photo to their internal chat, the mural from Eastway's Terminal B. Captioned simply, "He tore their ignorance down and built a standard." The image was reshared 6,000 times across internal networks. No one tagged Jamal, no one needed to. His presence had become the watermark on every conversation that touched power and race in motion. By the end of the week, 6 airports announced reforms. Chicago Midway committed to third-party audit reviews for security escalations. JFK introduced equity spotters, rotating staff who observed and corrected bias in real time. Vancouver International partnered with community leaders to revamp onboarding programs for frontline staff. Heathrow scrapped a legacy algorithm that flagged behavioral risk patterns disproportionately impacting minority travelers. O'Hare sent a personal invite to Lydia Grant to lead a reform task force. LAX quietly hired 3 consultants who'd formerly worked under Jamal. Inside Roads Dynamics, Noel received over 70 media requests asking for comment. All were ignored. Jamal's only directive, let the system explain itself. He didn't need to give interviews. The reforms were speaking in 100 different languages, policies, and pilot programs. He hadn't made a scene, he had shifted a culture, and the world, whether it liked it or not, had noticed. The low hum of the control tower echoed through the newly reinforced walls of Eastway International Airport. For the past 2 weeks, technicians, legal auditors, and security reform officers had worked in near silence behind closed doors. But now the final piece was ready to fall into place. In the privacy of a conference room on Level 8, Noel sat across from a compliance officer, reviewing the red file, the one that contained everything. Every complaint, every pattern, every incident, buried, Noel whispered as he slid the last sealed tab across the table. On its cover, Eastway Airport Staff Conduct Report Final Exposure. Meanwhile, Jamal Roads stood before a glass panel overlooking Gate 14, his reflection faint and somber. He wasn't smiling, he never did in moments like this. Not because he didn't feel satisfaction, but because this wasn't victory, it was reckoning. Quiet reckoning. The kind the world often forgets unless forced to confront it. Back on the terminal floor, Eli, the young employee who had first recognized Jamal, was now stationed behind the new guest care booth. His posture straighter, his voice steadier. He glanced up at a digital monitor flashing across all airport terminals. Statement of transparency to the public. Inside the conference room, legal advisors connected the screen to a secure network. The time was set, 2:00 p.m. At that hour, every internal monitor staff lounges, security stations, airline admin terminals would display a curated stream of unfiltered data. And beyond that, one link would be sent to press channels across the nation. It wouldn't be flashy, just evidence. At 1:58 p.m., Marcus Danner and Julian Brooks, both civil rights auditors from two separate federal agencies, took their seats beside Noel. "You're sure he wants this streamed live?" Julian asked. Noel nodded. "He doesn't need to say a word. Just let the facts speak." Jamal hadn't planned to give a statement. That changed only hours before when an internal transcript surfaced. A recorded conversation from weeks earlier between Alan Lawson and another supervisor, casually referencing people like him in regard to Jamal's ejection. The audio was clean. The racism was not subtle. At 2:00 p.m. sharp, the screen inside the media holding area switched. Reporters silenced their chatter. Passengers at the airport paused mid-step, and the words began scrolling. Security Supervisor Alan Lawson, 3 complaints of racial profiling, 2 unresolved, 1 settled silently. Officer Brent Lyle, 2 flagged incidents for aggressive behavior toward black passengers. Gate Agent Donna Weaver filed 6 misidentification reports over a year, all against non-white travelers. Internal messages recovered 87 flagged emails with discriminatory content, including slurs and coded exclusion language. Next came the video footage. Snapshots from the day Jamal was detained, edited not for dramatics, but for clarity. Jamal standing still, officers rummaging through his bag. Alan tearing his ticket and tossing the phone back. Then came the audio clip. "We've seen guys like that bluff into first class. One flash of an app and they think they're billionaires." A voice gasped in the press room. Someone dropped a pen. Across the airport screens flickered again. Internal audit conclusion. Eastway International Airport has been found in violation of equitable conduct standards under Clause 7.3. In Zurich, Jamal sat in a dim meeting room, not watching the stream, but reading the live feed of responses. Airlines issued apology statements. Several executives quietly stepped down. Civil rights organizations sent emails of solidarity. One message stood out. "We saw. Thank you for making sure everyone else had to." Back at Eastway, passengers stared at the final screen. Investor action roads. Dynamics has initiated emergency acquisition of Eastway Terminal Management. Interim ethics team to oversee until full compliance is restored. Then silence. Not one voice raised, not one press question shouted. Just the kind of quiet you only hear after a storm has broken something wide open. Eli watched from his post, tears in his eyes. A child nearby tugged his mother's sleeve and asked, "Is the bad man fired?" She nodded. "Looks like it." In the security wing, a dozen former staffers were escorted out quietly. No cuffs, no announcements, just exits, one by one. Inside HR, Tara sat alone reading her name in the report, her breath shallow. But she didn't contest it. Instead, she picked up the training manual that Jamal's team had introduced. She opened it. Page 1, respect is not policy, it's identity. Outside, a mural began to take shape, commissioned days earlier by Jamal, painted by local artists. It wasn't of him. It was of a crowd, black, white, Asian, Latino, old and young travelers and workers all looking forward. Underneath it, one word in stone enough. Jamal finally stood, slipping his phone into his pocket. He didn't speak to the media. He didn't post online. He boarded a train bound for Geneva and left the moment behind. Because the story had told itself. And now the world had listened. The early morning light poured through the glass panels of Eastway International Airport, casting long golden reflections across the polished floors. The air felt different, calmer, more purposeful. There was no announcement or ceremony to explain the transformation. It simply was. Gone were the frustrated mutterings at check-in counters and the weary sighs of staff trudging through their routines. In their place was something unspoken but powerful dignity. Inside Terminal B, travelers moved with ease. Check-in lines, once tense and chaotic, now flowed with courteous interactions and prompt assistance. A father with two small children was surprised when an attendant knelt to hand the kids a pair of souvenir wings and a coloring book. "Thank you," the man said, blinking at the badge that read trainee. "Respect First Initiative." The attendant simply smiled and nodded. In a quiet corner of the terminal, an elderly man in a beige trench coat observed the bustle with a curious expression. He had flown through Eastway for nearly 30 years. He remembered when the bathrooms smelled of mildew and staff barely looked passengers in the eye. Now a young employee had just walked him to the gate, carrying his bag without being asked. The man sat down and turned to a nearby reporter, jotting notes on a legal pad. "Feels like this place finally has a soul," he said softly. The reporter paused, underlined the quote twice, and looked around the terminal, visibly moved. Behind the scenes, the shift was even more profound. Staff lounges had been renovated with real seating, quiet zones, and free coffee stations. Orientation programs now included interactive training on equity, bias awareness, and cultural humility. For many employees, this was the first time they'd been told that how they treated others mattered just as much as how quickly they scanned a boarding pass. The cafeteria, once known for vending machines and stale sandwiches, now served fresh meals and offered an employee discount during peak hours. It was a small gesture, but it was spoken of more than pay raises. An anonymous morale survey conducted post-transition returned with a single word that hadn't appeared in over a decade: hopeful. Jamal Roads, however, was nowhere to be seen. The man who had quietly ignited the transformation wasn't featured in press photos, nor did he appear in interviews. His name hadn't graced a headline since the acquisition news first broke. Yet his presence pulsed through every corridor and gate number. From his hotel suite overlooking Lake Zurich, Jamal scrolled through internal reports on a secure tablet. He noted performance data, customer service scores, compliance updates, and audit flags. Every improvement made him pause, not with pride, but with confirmation. Null sat across from him, reviewing employee profiles on his laptop, occasionally glancing up as if waiting for Jamal to speak. But Jamal remained silent, focused. Null began adjusting his glasses. "The media is begging for a sit-down. You could reshape airport security nationwide with one interview." Jamal didn't look up. His thumb slowly scrolled through another chart. "Let the work speak," he finally said. Null closed his laptop and leaned forward. "Don't you think people deserve to know how this happened? You rebuilt a major U.S. airport in under a week." Jamal turned to him, voice quiet but resolute. "This was never about applause. It was about removing excuses. The right people already heard the message. At that exact moment across Eastway's terminals, those very people were carrying that message forward. Supervisors who had once looked the other way were now redirecting complaints to the new equity board. Staff members who had been dismissed for speaking out in the past were now being trained as ethics mentors. Then came the mural. In the atrium of the airport's main hall, a massive two-story painting was unveiled with no fanfare, no press, and no announcement. It simply appeared one morning. Painted in bold strokes of storm gray and electric gold, the mural depicted a man in a black hoodie standing in the center of swirling chaos. Torn paper, rushing wind, fractured glass, but his stance was steady, quiet, unshakable. Below him, carved into the marble wall, was one word: Rize. Travelers stopped to stare. Some took photos. Others just paused, sensing that something profound had happened in this space. One young boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Who is he?" A nearby check-in agent answered without missing a beat, "A man who believes respect should come standard." Back in Zurich, Jamal received a photo of the mural in a text from Lydia Grant. No caption, no explanation, just the image. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Later that evening, standing alone in the quiet of his suite, Jamal finally whispered something only the walls heard. "Let them rise." He walked to the window and looked out over the lake, the lights of the city shimmering in the distance. Behind him, the tablet still glowed softly on the table, filled with dashboards and data, but none of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was the silence. A silence filled not with fear or erasure, but with dignity restored. 3 weeks after Eastway International Airport had quietly rewritten its own code of conduct, the ripples of change were no longer just local. They were national. Airport officials across the country began requesting consultation calls with Roads Dynamics, hoping to learn how Eastway had undergone such a radical shift in culture with barely any external disruption. No strikes, no shutdowns, just transformation. Behind the scenes, Jamal Roads remained characteristically silent. No interviews, no public statements, but the systems he left behind spoke for him. The Respect First initiative, once an internal project, was now requested by over a dozen other airports. Regional hubs in Dallas, Newark, and Seattle were already piloting similar reform modules. Desmond Tate, now head of security at Eastway, led the first national symposium on bias reduction and ethical enforcement. "We were never trained to see our own assumptions," he said, "but now we train others how to dismantle theirs." At the back of the conference room, Lydia Grant watched with quiet pride. She had just been named National Equity Liaison for Transportation, the first time the position had ever existed. The mural at Eastway became a symbol far beyond its walls. Travelers from around the world began visiting the terminal just to see it. A feature in Architectural Digest called it the quietest revolution ever painted. Teachers brought students. Veterans stopped to salute it. Elders stood and wept. In the months that followed, Horizon News published a report titled "The Eastway Standard," examining how one airport had become the blueprint for humane travel experiences. According to their study, customer satisfaction had jumped 41% in less than 60 days. Employee turnover dropped by half. Bias complaints fell 83%. The numbers were staggering, but it wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was the feeling. Passengers now entered Eastway and felt something rare in public infrastructure welcome. They weren't treated like liabilities or bodies to be processed. They were spoken to, looked in the eye, assisted before they even asked. The mural became more than art. It became a pilgrimage. And beneath that mural, travelers often stood and read the single word carved into the marble rise. Jamal watched all of it unfold from a distance. Still headquartered in Zurich, he focused on expanding Roads Dynamics' infrastructure equity platform into Europe and Asia. But every Friday he received a report from Eastway. Not about profits, not even about efficiency. It detailed stories, moments, human responses, like the time an elderly Korean woman missed her flight due to a language barrier and a young staffer walked her to the lounge, brought her tea, and rescheduled her trip. Or when a formerly incarcerated man applying for a custodial position burst into tears after learning Eastway didn't just give second chances, they trained for them. Or when a teenage girl from St. Louis posted a photo of the mural on social media with the caption, "I don't know who he is, but I want to be like him." Jamal saved that image. It became his phone's lock screen. Noel had once asked him weeks earlier if they should publish a memoir document, the turnaround, share the strategy. Jamal had declined, but now quietly he had begun writing. Not a book, not for an audience, but a letter. A long one. It began, "To the child who sees this and wonders if silence means weakness, it does not." The final draft, nearly 50 pages long, would be sealed and stored in the Eastway archives to be opened 10 years from now by whoever succeeded Desmond Tate. Jamal called it "Instructions for the Future." At Eastway, the changes deepened. Hiring panels now required at least one representative trained in equity screening. Every new employee, regardless of role, received a welcome card with the words, "Respect is standard here. You are part of that standard." Alan Lawson's name never returned to the roster, but not all stories were closed. 6 months after the incident, Jamal received a handwritten letter with no return address. Inside was a simple apology written in tight cursive. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't excuse behavior. It acknowledged harm. Jamal read it twice, then placed it in a drawer with the headline clipping from that first viral moment. He didn't respond, but he didn't discard it either. Legacy wasn't about erasure, it was about recognition. 1 year later, a small ceremony was held at Eastway. It wasn't publicized, no press attended, just 40 staff members standing beneath the mural at sunrise. Desmond gave a short speech. Lydia read a poem. And then in silence, they placed a single stone at the foot of the painting, a tradition borrowed from cultures that mark grave sites with presents instead of flowers. The inscription on the stone was brief. It read, "He stood, so we moved." And just like that, the legacy was complete. 1 year after the transformation of Eastway International Airport, the building no longer simply served travelers, it inspired them. The marble floors, once scuffed and rushed over by indifferent feet, now shimmered under softer lights. The lines moved smoother, not because of new software, but because of new attitudes. Kindness, once a luxury, had become protocol. Inside the executive wing, previously closed off to the public, stood a small glass room, now known as the listening office. Anyone could walk in and speak with a senior staffer, no appointment needed. And they did. A teenager who lost her bag. A grandmother who felt ignored. A janitor with a better floor plan. They were all heard, logged, and followed up on within 48 hours. Not because of policy, but because of promise. The airport didn't just serve the people, it mirrored them. At the heart of it all, the mural remained. It never faded. Its colors stayed sharp, its message sharper. New hires were brought to it during orientation. This, trainers would say, is our compass. Beneath it, the carved word "Rise" was now joined by a second plaque added during the anniversary ceremony. It read, "Dignity begins when silence ends." On a crisp Monday morning, Jamal Roads returned to Eastway unannounced. He wore no suit, just the same black hoodie from a year ago. A security guard recognized him, started to rise from his chair, but Jamal smiled, waved him down, and said, "I'm just here to walk." He moved slowly, taking in the new decor, the subtle energy shifts. He paused near a gate where a young girl with a speech delay was being helped, not hurried by a staff member kneeling to her level. Jamal didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, then kept walking. In Terminal C, he found a small kiosk that hadn't existed before. Above it read, "Respect First Desk." A man behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" "No," Jamal replied softly. "You already did." He kept walking. Outside, he stood at the drop-off zone and watched a father help his son with a heavy suitcase. No shouting, no rushing, just care. Jamal closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The air had changed. And it wasn't just Eastway. The legacy had traveled. Across the country, 5 other airports had adopted the Respect First model. 2 major airlines introduced equity training in flight staff onboarding. A coalition of CEOs had signed on to a policy charter co-authored by Rhodes Dynamics and civil rights leaders. The story had become legend, not because it was loud, but because it was lived. Yet Jamal never tried to trademark it, never claimed royalties. He told his legal team, "You don't own what was never meant to be sold." Instead, he established a trust, an independent equity foundation seeded with his own funds. It now offered grants to schools, nonprofits, and public transit hubs, wanting to implement the same changes Eastway had. Its motto was printed on the website in bold letters: "Silent systems, loud reform." The press still tried to interview him. Book agents still called. A major studio offered rights for a dramatization. Jamal declined them all. He believed the story worked best when it came from others. And it did. At a high school in Detroit, a senior gave her valedictorian speech about the airport mural. In Seattle, a city bus driver quoted Jamal in a union newsletter. In a courtroom in Atlanta, a judge referenced the Eastway audit protocols while ruling on a workplace discrimination suit. The story moved not as headlines, but as seeds. And what of Jamal himself? He returned to Zurich, but not to retreat. He began mentoring a new generation of ethical technologists. He taught them that software solves problems, but systems solve people. He told them to stop chasing efficiency and start designing for dignity. One night at a small roundtable gathering in Bern, a young woman asked him, "When did you know the airport would change?" Jamal paused, looked out the window at the quiet skyline and said, "When I stopped trying to change the place and started changing the pattern." That line would later be quoted in classrooms, boardrooms, and graduation speeches. But for Jamal, the greatest legacy came one morning when he received a message from someone he didn't know. It was a photo of 2 boys standing in front of the mural at Eastway. One wore a toy pilot's cap. The caption read, "He said he wants to be the man in the hoodie." Jamal smiled. He wrote no reply. He simply whispered, "Then the mission is working." If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more narratives that expose injustice and celebrate quiet revolutions.